brutal, final push through the mountains of Italy in 1944, an entire U.S. Army company was ordered to abandon an indefensible hill in the face of a German counterattack. Military doctrine, and their own commanders, said the position was a death trap, an impossible place to hold. But one black sergeant from a segregated infantry unit saw it differently. He refused the order to retreat. He stayed behind, alone, a solitary ghost on a forsaken mountain. For one long, bloody night, the fate of hundreds of American soldiers rested on his shoulders. The Army said it was impossible until they saw what he had done. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, let me tell you the story. The rain in the Apennine Mountains in the autumn of 1944 was a cold, miserable, and constant thing. It was a rain that did not just fall, but seemed to seep up from the ground itself, turning the steep, rocky slopes into a treacherous, ankle-deep quagmire of mud and shattered rock. For the men of the 92nd Infantry Division, the all-black unit known as the Buffalo Soldiers, this was the grim, unforgiving landscape of the Gothic Line, the last and most formidable of the German defensive lines in Italy. It was a war of attrition, a brutal, grinding, and almost entirely vertical conflict, fought for control of nameless, barren hilltops that were defended by an entrenched, determined, and battle-hardened enemy. Staff Sergeant Rosco Pedigrew, a man who seemed more a part of these mountains than the segregated army he served in, felt the cold mud suck at his boots as he scanned the terrain ahead. At 28, he was a quiet, self-reliant man from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, a place of deep woods and steep hills that had, in a strange and brutal irony, prepared him perfectly for this war. He was a hunter, a trapper, a man who knew how to read the land, how to use its folds and its shadows for cover, how to move with a quiet, patient economy of motion that was lost on the city boys who made up most of his squad. His quiet demeanor and his thick, country drawl had caused more than one white officer to dismiss him as a simple-minded rustic, but his men knew the truth. They knew that his sharp, practical intelligence, his almost supernatural understanding of the terrain, was the single most important reason any of them were still alive. Their objective on this miserable, rain-swept morning was a piece of high ground designated on the maps as Hill 734. It was not a mountain, in the grand sense of the word, but a steep, craggy, and brutally exposed hill that commanded a perfect, sweeping view of the valley below. The Germans, as was their custom, had turned it into a fortress. They were dug in, their machine gun nests, their mortar pits, their sniper hides, all perfectly positioned, all mutually supporting, a web of interlocking fire that had already chewed up 2 American assaults that morning. Roscoe's squad, what was left of it, was pinned down behind a miserable, inadequate outcropping of rock, the air around them alive with the angry, snapping sound of German machine gun fire. He could feel the fear of his men, a palpable, vibrating thing in the cold, wet air. He could see it in the wide, terrified eyes of Private Cecil Covington, a 19-year-old draftee from the bustling, flat streets of Chicago, a boy who was as out of his element in these mountains as a fish was on dry land. Cecil, like the rest of the squad, looked to Roscoe not just as a sergeant, but as an anchor, a source of almost mystical, backwoods competence in a world that had become a chaotic, terrifying, and utterly alien nightmare. The order to attack, when it came crackling over the field radio, was met with a kind of grim, fatalistic resignation. It was the 3rd time they would be asked to charge up that open, muddy slope, directly into the teeth of that perfectly positioned and very much awake German defense. It was not a tactic. It was a meat grinder. But it was an order. Roscoe gave the signal, his face a mask of calm, professional resolve that betrayed none of the cold, hard certainty in his own heart. He knew that this attack, like the 2 before it, was doomed to fail. He knew that more of his men were about to die for a piece of ground that the Army, in its infinite and often baffling wisdom, had decided was worth the price of their lives. He took a deep breath, the cold, wet air burning in his lungs, and then he blew his whistle. Its sharp, shrill cry a signal for the beginning of another act in the brutal, bloody, and almost certainly futile drama of their assault. Captain Wallace Davenport, commander of Dog Company, 92nd Infantry Division, monitored the third assault on Hill 734 from the relative safety of his command post, a muddy, sandbagged hole a half-mile behind the front line. He was a man who saw the war not as a chaotic, emotional brawl, but as a series of complex, logistical problems to be solved with the cool, dispassionate logic of military doctrine. A career officer from a proud military family in New England, he trusted maps, he trusted manuals, and he trusted the established, time-tested principles of warfare that he had been taught at West Point. And his training, his experience, and every instinct in his by-the-book military mind told him that this assault was a catastrophic and tragically predictable mistake. He listened to the crackle of the radio, his radio man jotting down the frantic, fragmented reports from the platoon leaders on the line. The reports told a story he already knew, a story of murderous, interlocking machine gun fire, of accurate, relentless mortar barrages, of an enemy that was deeply entrenched, perfectly positioned, and showing no signs of breaking. He looked at his map, at the neat, contoured lines that depicted Hill 734. He could see the problem with a cold, geometric clarity. The hill was a natural fortress, a perfect defensive position. The slopes were too steep, the cover too sparse. The Germans held the high ground, and in this kind of vertical mountain warfare, the high ground was everything. Captain Davenport was not a cruel man. He did not, as some of his fellow officers did, harbor a deep, personal animosity towards the black soldiers under his command. But he was a product of his time, and of an army that was still deeply, systemically, and institutionally racist. He viewed the men of the 92nd Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, with a kind of deep-seated, almost paternalistic skepticism. He believed, as the Army's own internal studies had concluded, that they were, as a group, lacking in the kind of initiative, the tactical discipline, the innate fighting spirit that was required for complex offensive operations. He saw them as adequate support troops, as laborers, but not as frontline assault infantry. And this assault, this brutal, head-on charge against a fortified position, was, in his professional opinion, a mission that was far beyond their capabilities. The casualty reports that were now coming in were confirming his worst fears. The 1st and 2nd platoons were being cut to pieces, their advance stalled, their men pinned down and being systematically slaughtered. The 3rd platoon, the one that included Staff Sergeant Rosco Pedigrew's squad, was not even responding to his radio calls. They were, he assumed, either all dead or too deep in the mud and the fire to even try to answer. The assault was not just failing, it was a massacre. He made a decision. It was a decision that would, he knew, be seen as a failure by his superiors. It was a decision that would put a black mark on his own, previously spotless, service record. But it was, in his mind, the only logical, the only responsible, and the only sane choice to make. He was a captain of men, and his first, and most important, duty was to preserve the lives of those men, to not waste them in a pointless, futile, and badly conceived gesture of aggression. He took the radio handset from his operator. "All Dog Company units," he said, his voice a calm, authoritative command that betrayed none of the frustration and anger he felt. "This is Dog 6. I am calling off the attack. I say again, I am calling off the attack. Break contact and withdraw to the rally point. Acknowledge, one by one." The acknowledgements came crackling back. A series of relieved, and often desperate, "Roger, Dog 6" from the surviving platoon leaders. The assault was over. The hill, for now, belonged to the Germans. It was a tactical defeat, but it was, in Captain Davenport's cold, logical, and by-the-book assessment, a necessary one. He had saved what was left of his company. The hill, he wrote in his preliminary after-action report, was an untenable position, its capture an operational impossibility. He had made the right call, the only call. He had no way of knowing that, on the bloody, rain-swept slopes of that same untenable hill, one of his own sergeants, a man he had consistently underestimated, was, at that very moment, in the process of proving him wrong, While Captain Davenport's order to retreat was crackling over the radios in the valley below, Staff Sergeant Rosco Pedigrew and the battered, bleeding remnant of his squad were engaged in a desperate, close-quarters fight for their lives. They were unaware of the order, their own radio having been shattered by a piece of shrapnel minutes earlier. They were operating in their own private, isolated pocket of hell, a world that had shrunk to a few square yards of mud, rock, and the terrifying, deafening roar of a German MG-42 machine gun. The third assault, like the two before it, had been a bloody, grinding failure. But in the midst of the chaos, Rosco, with his hunter's eye for the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the rhythm of a battle, had seen something. He had seen a momentary gap in the German defenses, a brief, fleeting lull in the fire from a key machine gun nest on the right flank of the hill. It was the result of a lucky American mortar round, a shot in the dark that had, for a few precious seconds, stunned the German crew. It was not a breach. It was a crack, and it was all the opening he needed. "On me!" he had yelled, his voice a raw, powerful command that cut through the fear of his surviving men. And in a single, desperate, and almost suicidal rush, he had led them up the final, steepest part of the slope, directly into the heart of the German position. They had swarmed the machine gun nest in a furious, adrenaline-fueled assault of bayonets and grenades. The fight had been a brutal, primitive affair, a chaotic, close-quarters brawl that was over in less than a minute. And when it was over, the machine gun nest belonged to them. They had captured a single, vital, and incredibly precarious foothold near the summit of Hill 734. The position was a small, sandbagged, and well-constructed German emplacement, and it offered a commanding view of both the German positions further up the hill and the valley below. But their victory was a fragile, and likely very temporary, thing. The 5 surviving members of his squad, including the young, terrified, but still functioning Private Cecil Covington, were now a tiny, isolated island of American resistance in a sea of German gray. They were cut off, their ammunition was dangerously low, and they all knew, in a position that was completely and utterly exposed to a German counterattack. They took stock of their situation. They had 2 men with minor wounds. They had less than 100 rounds of ammunition for their Monet rifles, but they had the German machine gun. The MG-42, the weapon the Germans called Hitler's buzzsaw, was one of the most feared and effective infantry weapons of the entire war. A marvel of brutal, efficient engineering that could fire at a blistering rate of over 1,200 rounds a minute. And, more importantly, the Germans, in their hasty retreat from the position, had left behind several heavy, metal boxes of ammunition. They had the gun, and they had the bullets. It was a small, but significant consolation. It was then that the order to retreat finally reached them. A runner from the 2nd platoon, a man who had been making his way across the battlefield, stumbled into their position, his face pale with shock and exhaustion. He delivered Captain Davenport's message. The attack was over, and all units were to withdraw. For the few, exhausted survivors of Roscoe's squad, the news was a profound, almost overwhelming wave of relief. They had survived. They were being called back from the brink of certain death. They began to gather their gear, their movements filled with the frantic, joyful energy of men who had just been given a reprieve from their own execution. But Rosco Pedigrew did not move. He was not looking at his men. He was looking through the captured, high-powered German trench binoculars, his gaze fixed on the German positions on the true summit of the hill, a few hundred yards above them. And what he saw there made the blood in his veins run cold. Captain Davenport, from his command post in the valley, was looking at a map. Rosco was looking at the reality. And the reality was that the Germans were not consolidating their defenses. They were not digging in for another American assault. They were massing. He could see dozens of German soldiers, their distinctive coal scuttle helmets a clear, menacing silhouette against the gray, rainy sky, pouring out of their deeper, more fortified bunkers. They were forming up into assault squads. They were preparing for a counterattack, and it was not a probing, cautious counterattack. It was a massive, overwhelming, and immediate assault, designed to do one thing: to pour down the mountainside like a human avalanche, and to catch the retreating and completely exposed American company in the open valley below. It was a trap, and the entire company was walking right into it. The moment that followed was one of the defining moments of Rosco Pedigrew's life. It was a moment of profound, terrible, and absolute clarity. He stood in the captured German machine gun nest, the crackle of the retreating American forces on the borrowed radio in one ear, and the sight of the massing German counterattack in his eyes. He saw the two separate realities of the battlefield with a stark, brutal, and unforgiving precision. He saw his own, small, battered squad of survivors, their faces filled with the joyful, desperate relief of men who had been given a second chance at life. And he saw the rest of his company, hundreds of his fellow soldiers, his brothers in arms, completely oblivious, walking into a perfectly laid and absolutely certain massacre. He was a staff sergeant in the United States Army. He was a man who had been trained, who had been conditioned to follow orders. His orders were clear, direct, and unambiguous. He was to retreat. He was to save himself and the few surviving men under his command. It was the logical thing to do. It was the sane thing to do. It was the thing that every instinct for self-preservation, every ounce of his own fear, was screaming at him to do. But Rosco Pedigrew was not just a soldier. He was a hunter. And a hunter knows that sometimes the only way to save the herd is for one lone stag to turn and face the wolves. He made a decision. It was a decision that was not born of a sudden, rash impulse. It was a cold, hard, and brutally pragmatic calculation. He looked at the German MG-42 machine gun, at the heavy, metal boxes of ammunition. He looked down the slope of the hill, at the perfect, natural kill zone that the approach to his position offered. And he did the math. The math of a rearguard action. The math of a sacrifice. The math that said that one gun, in the right hands, in the right place, at the right time, could be the difference between a successful withdrawal and a complete and total annihilation. He turned to his men. Their gear was packed. They were ready to go. They were looking at him. Their expressions a mixture of relief and an impatient, questioning urgency. "We ain't leaving," he said, his voice a quiet, calm, and utterly implacable statement of fact. The men stared at him, their relief dissolving into a state of shocked, disbelieving confusion. Private Cecil Covington, the young kid from Chicago, was the first to speak. But Sergeant," he stammered, "the order. Captain Davenport said we're to pull back." "I heard the order," Rosco said, his gaze as steady and as unyielding as the mountain they were standing on. He pointed up the hill, towards the summit. "And I see them." He handed the binoculars to Cecil. "You tell me what you see." Cecil took the binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up at the German positions, and in that moment, he saw what Rosco had seen. He saw the massing troops. He saw the machine gun teams setting up on the flanks. He saw the cold, methodical, and terrifying preparations for a slaughter. His face went pale. "My God," he whispered. "They're gonna kill them all." "That's right," Rosco said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "They are, unless someone up here keeps their heads down, unless someone up here makes them pay for every single inch of this ground." He turned to the rest of his men. His expression was not one of a fanatic, or of a man with a death wish. It was the expression of a teacher, of a leader, explaining a difficult, but necessary, lesson. "I'm staying," he said. "I'm staying on this gun, but you all are leaving. That's my final order. You are to get down this hill, and you are to link up with the rest of the company. You are to tell Captain Davenport what is happening up here. You are to get to safety." He was not asking them. He was telling them. He was a staff sergeant, and in the absence of a commissioned officer, his word was law. He was ordering them to live, and he was choosing, with a calm, deliberate, and absolute resolve, to die. The small, sandbagged German machine gun nest became a stage for a brief, desperate, and heartbreaking drama of protest and command. Rosco Pedigrew's men, who had been on the verge of a joyful, life-affirming retreat, were now being ordered to abandon their sergeant to a fate that was not just a risk, but a statistical certainty. They did not want to go. They were soldiers, and the idea of leaving a man behind, of leaving their leader behind, was a violation of the deepest, most sacred code of their brotherhood. "We can't leave you, Sarge," one of them protested, his voice a mixture of fear and a fierce, stubborn loyalty. "We'll stay and fight with you." "No," Rosco said, his voice calm, but with an edge of cold, hard authority that silenced any further argument. "You will not. There is one gun, and only one man needs to be on it. The rest of you will be nothing but extra targets. Your job is not to die up here with me. Your job is to get down this mountain and to ensure that the rest of the company knows what's coming. That is a direct order, and it is the last order I will be giving you. Now, move." He turned to Private Cecil Covington. The young man from Chicago was in a state of shock, his face a mask of disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. He was 19 years old. He had been in combat for less than a month, and he was now being asked to participate in a decision that was so far beyond his comprehension, so contrary to every instinct for survival and for loyalty, that his mind could barely process it. He looked at his sergeant, at this quiet, backwoods man who had, for the past few weeks, been his anchor of sanity, his symbol of an almost mythical competence in a world of chaos and death, and he could not understand. He could not understand why this man, who was so good at living, was so calmly choosing to die. Rosco saw the confusion and the terror in the young private's eyes. He put a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "It's all right, son," he said, his voice softening, the hard edge of command replaced by a gentle, almost paternal reassurance. "You just do your job. You get down there, and you tell them, 'You be my witness.'" He pushed a small, battered field compass into Cecil's hand. "Now you get going, and you don't look back." Reluctantly, his men began to move, their faces a mixture of grief, of fear, and of a profound, uncomprehending respect. They scrambled out of the machine gun nest and began the dangerous, desperate journey back down the mountainside, their movements a frantic, chaotic retreat. Cecil Covington was the last to leave. He hesitated for a moment at the edge of the emplacement, his eyes locked on his sergeant. Rosco was no longer looking at him. He was already at work, his movements calm, methodical, and efficient. He was checking the action of the MG-42. He was lining up the heavy metal belts of German ammunition. He was a craftsman, a professional, a man preparing for the most difficult and the most important job of his life. He was a solitary, lonely figure against the gray, indifferent sky, a quiet mountain man who was about to face down an entire German company, alone. Cecil finally turned and ran, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, the words of his sergeant, "You be my witness," echoing in his mind. He did not look back. He did not need to. The image of Rosco Pedigrew, a lone, defiant figure preparing for his final, impossible stand, was an image that would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. He was the first, and for now, the only, witness to an act of courage so profound, so absolute, that it defied all logic, all reason, and all the established rules of war. As soon as his men were gone, Rosco Pedigrew went to work. The quiet, almost serene calm that had defined his demeanor in the face of his men's panic was replaced by a kind of focused, predatory intensity. He was no longer a sergeant in the U.S. Army. He was a hunter, and this small captured piece of high ground was now his territory. The German company that was massing on the summit above him was no longer an overwhelming military force. They were a pack of wolves, and he was the lone, cornered stag that was about to turn the tables on them. He was not just preparing for a defense, he was preparing for a hunt. He had, by his own cold calculation, less than 10 minutes before the German counterattack would begin. He used every second of that time with a brutal, efficient economy of motion that was born of a lifetime spent in the deep, unforgiving woods of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was not just a man with a machine gun. He was a master of the terrain. And he knew, with an instinct that was deeper and more reliable than any military training, how to make the land itself his most powerful weapon. He began by resituating the MG-42. The Germans had positioned it for a frontal defense, to repel an attack coming up the hill. Rosco, with a few powerful heaves, repositioned it at a sharp 45-degree angle, aiming it not at the summit, but at a narrow, natural gully on the right flank of his position. He knew, with a hunter's certainty, that this gully, the one spot that offered the most cover from a frontal assault, was the path the Germans would use for their main flanking maneuver. He was not going to wait for them to come to him. He was going to channel them into a perfectly prepared kill zone. Next, he turned his attention to the captured German supplies. He was not just interested in the ammunition. He found a crate of potato masher stick grenades. He did not just stack them by his side. He took a spool of tripwire from his own pack, and with a series of quick, expert knots, he created a network of ingenious, improvised booby traps in the rocks and the scrub brush on the left flank of his position, the side that was most vulnerable to a direct, overwhelming rush. An unsuspecting German soldier, charging through the brush, would snag the wire and pull the pins on a cluster of 3 grenades, a surprise that would not just kill him, but would also serve as a noisy and terrifying early warning system. He then took his own few remaining grenades and placed them on the lip of the sandbagged emplacement in front of him. He did not plan to throw them. He had a different, and far more terrible, purpose in mind for them. They were his final, desperate, and very personal insurance policy. Finally, he arranged the heavy metal belts of German ammunition in a neat, accessible arc around his position. He checked the action of the MG42 one last time. The smooth, oily click of the bolt, a sound of deep, professional satisfaction. He was ready. He settled in behind the big, brutally efficient German gun, his eye lining up the sights, his hands gripping the handles with a familiarity that was both strange and deeply, profoundly right. He looked out at the barren, rocky landscape in front of him. To a soldier, it was a death trap. To him, it was home ground. He was no longer Rosco Pedigrew, the quiet, underestimated sergeant from the segregated 92nd Infantry Division. He was a ghost on the mountain, a hunter waiting for the prey to walk into his trap. And as he heard the first faint sounds of the German advance, the clatter of loose rock, the bark of a German NCO's command, he did not feel fear. He felt a strange, cold, and almost serene sense of calm. The hunt was about to begin. The German counterattack began not with a bugle charge, but with a confident, almost arrogant advance. They were a veteran company of Gebirgsjäger, German mountain troops, elite soldiers who were masters of this kind of vertical, high-altitude warfare. They had been momentarily stunned by the loss of their machine gun nest, but they had quickly regrouped. They knew that the American unit that had taken the position was small, isolated, and almost certainly out of ammunition. Their mission was a simple and, in their minds, an easy one: to retake the position, to sweep the few remaining Americans from the hillside, and then to pour down into the valley and to annihilate the retreating and now completely exposed American company. Their commander, a seasoned and highly competent Hauptmann, had devised a textbook assault plan. The main body of his force would lay down a heavy suppressing fire on the captured machine gun nest, while a platoon-sized element would use the cover of the gully on the right flank to get in behind the American position and to take it from the rear. It was a classic, and almost always successful, tactic of fire and maneuver. It was a tactic that assumed that the enemy would behave in a predictable and a logical way. The German suppressing fire began, a storm of rifle and machine gun fire that hammered the sandbagged American position. But there was no answering fire. The position was silent. The Hauptmann smiled. It was just as he had suspected. The Americans were either all dead or were cowering in their holes, waiting for the inevitable. He gave the signal for his flanking platoon to begin their advance. The German mountain troops moved with a swift, professional confidence. They entered the narrow, rocky gully, their movements sure-footed and efficient, their weapons held at the ready. They were the hunters, and the few, terrified Americans in the nest above them were the prey. They pushed deeper into the gully, their confidence growing with every step. The position was just ahead. They were about to deliver the final, killing blow. And then, the world exploded. From the silent, seemingly empty machine gun nest, the German MG42, their own, beloved, and brutally effective weapon, erupted in a deafening, terrifying roar. Rosco Pedigrew had waited. He had watched them, his hunter's patience a thing of cold, perfect, and absolute discipline. He had let them get deep into the gully, let them bunch up in the narrow, confined space where there was no cover, no room to maneuver, no escape. And then, he had opened fire. The effect was not just a slaughter. It was an annihilation. The stream of heavy, German-made bullets, fired at a rate of 20 rounds per second, tore through the tightly packed ranks of the German flanking platoon. The gully became a charnel house, a narrow, inescapable corridor of death. The Germans, who had been the confident, professional hunters just seconds before, were now the panicked, terrified, and dying prey. They had walked, with a perfect, textbook precision, directly into a perfectly laid and perfectly executed ambush. The German hauptmann, hearing the unbelievable and deeply, personally insulting sound of his own machine gun being used against him, stared in a state of shocked, disbelieving fury. His entire flanking platoon had been shattered in a matter of seconds. His textbook assault plan was in ruins, and the single, solitary, and seemingly indestructible machine gun on the hill was now a source of not just a tactical problem, but of a deep and growing sense of professional dread. He did not know who was on that gun. He did not know how many of them there were. But he knew that the man, or the men, he was facing were not the terrified, incompetent soldiers he had been led to expect. He was facing a professional, a ghost, a hunter who had just turned his own, well-laid trap back on him. Down in the valley, the first, panicked and almost incoherent reports from the survivors of Rosco Pedigrew's squad were being met with a mixture of confusion, of pity, and of a deep, professional skepticism. Private Cecil Covington, his face streaked with mud and tears, was trying to explain the unexplainable to his company commander. "He stayed behind, sir," Cecil was stammering, his voice a mixture of awe and a kind of hysterical, disbelieving terror. "Sergeant Pedigrew, he stayed on the German gun. He said he was going to hold them off." Captain Wallace Davenport listened, his expression a mask of weary, paternalistic patience. He had a hysterical, shell-shocked private in front of him, a boy who had clearly been broken by the horrors of the past few hours. The story he was telling was a fantasy, a piece of battlefield delusion. A single sergeant, staying behind to face an entire German company, alone. It was not just improbable, it was a tactical and a physical impossibility. It was the stuff of cheap Hollywood war movies, not the grim, bloody reality of the Gothic line. "At ease, Private," Davenport had said, his voice gentle but with an undercurrent of firm, dismissive authority. "You're in shock. Get yourself some water and report to the aid station." And then they heard it. It was a sound that was both familiar and deeply, chillingly alien. It was the sound of a German MG-42 machine gun, Hitler's buzzsaw. But it was not firing down at them. It was firing up, on the hill, away from them. It was a deep, thunderous, and continuous roar of defiance, the sound of a single solitary weapon that was engaged in a furious, one-sided conversation with an entire company of German rifles. A profound, disbelieving silence fell over the American command post. Every man, from Captain Davenport down to the lowest private, froze, their heads cocked, listening to the impossible sound echoing down from the summit of Hill 734. The sound was not just the sound of a battle. It was the sound of a story that was being written in real time, in a language of pure, unadulterated violence. And that story was a direct and a powerful contradiction of everything Captain Davenport had believed to be true. The young, hysterical Private Cecil Covington was not hysterical anymore. His face was filled with a kind of fierce, vindicated pride. "That's him, sir," he said, his voice no longer stammering, but filled with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "That's Sergeant Pedigrew." The sound of that lone, defiant machine gun became the soundtrack to the company's survival. For the next hour, as the exhausted, battered survivors of Dog Company made their way down the valley to a new, more defensible position, the sound of Roscoe's gun was a constant, protective, and almost unbelievable presence behind them. It was the sound of a promise being kept. It was the sound of a single, solitary man, a man his own captain had dismissed as a tactical impossibility, holding back an entire German company, buying them the precious, vital minutes they needed to escape the trap that had been laid for them. The legend of the ghost of Hill 734 was born in that hour, in the minds of the men who owed their lives to that impossible and beautiful sound. They did not know his name yet. They did not know the details of his impossible stand. They only knew one thing, with a certainty that was as deep and as absolute as their own survival, that somewhere up on that dark, rain-swept mountain, a single American soldier was performing a miracle. The battle for the summit of Hill 734 was not a battle. It was a lonely, brutal, and intensely personal war. For the next 12 hours, through the long, cold, and rainy night, Rosco Pedigrew held his ground. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a force of nature, a part of the mountain itself, a ghost who haunted the nightmares of the German company that was trying, with an increasing and increasingly futile desperation, to kill him. The Germans, after the initial catastrophic failure of their flanking maneuver, had regrouped. They were professionals, and they were not going to be defeated by a single, mysterious machine gun. They tried a direct, frontal assault, a wave of infantry charging up the main slope of the hill, their bayonets fixed, their battle cries a furious, guttural roar. And it was then that they discovered Rosco's second surprise, the network of improvised tripwire-activated grenade traps. The frontal assault dissolved into a series of chaotic, disorienting explosions. The Germans, who were not killed by the shrapnel, thrown into a state of panicked confusion, easy targets for the calm, methodical, and brutally effective bursts of fire from Rosco's MG-42. They tried to take him out with mortars. They blanketed the summit with high explosive shells, the entire hilltop disappearing in a series of geysers of mud, rock, and fire. But Rosco was a hunter. He knew how to read the signs. The moment the first mortar shell screamed overhead, he was gone, retreating from the exposed machine gun nest into a deeper, more fortified German bunker that he had discovered further back from the summit, a place of thick, reinforced concrete that could withstand a direct hit. He would wait out the barrage, and the moment it lifted, the moment the German infantry began their next, confident assault on the now silent position, he would be back at his gun, his fire once again catching them in the open, in the kill zone. He was wounded, a piece of shrapnel from a near-miss mortar shell having torn a deep, bleeding gash in his left arm. The wound was painful, and it made operating the heavy, powerful machine gun a slow, agonizing process. He was exhausted, his body a single, screaming symphony of pain and fatigue. He was running out of ammunition, the neat, orderly stacks of German ammo boxes now a scattered, dwindling resource. But he held on. He became a master of a kind of psychological warfare. He would fire in short, disciplined bursts, from slightly different positions, creating the illusion of multiple guns, of a much larger force. He would let the Germans get close, so close he could see the whites of their eyes, and then he would open fire, his sudden, terrifying bursts of violence not just killing them, but shattering their morale, planting the seeds of a deep, superstitious dread in their hearts. They were not fighting a man anymore. They were fighting a ghost, a demon, a spirit of the mountain that could not be killed. Sometime before dawn, in the darkest, coldest hour of the night, they made one last, desperate attempt. A small elite squad of German commandos, armed with submachine guns and satchel charges, tried to crawl up the backside of the hill to take him by stealth. But Rosco was a man of the mountains. He heard them. He heard the faint, almost imperceptible scrape of a boot on rock, the rustle of a uniform against the wet brush. He did not use the machine gun. He used his last, few, precious American grenades. He waited until they were in the perfect spot, and then he threw, his aim sure and true. The series of dull, concussive thumps in the darkness was followed by a profound and a final silence. And then it was over. The Germans were broken. They had had enough. The solitary, impossible ghost on the mountain had defeated them. As the first, gray, and almost imperceptible light of the dawn began to break over the eastern horizon, Rosco Pedigrew, his body a wreck, his ammunition gone, his mission complete, finally allowed himself to rest. He slumped forward, over the silent, cooling bulk of his German machine gun, and the long, lonely, and heroic night on Hill 734 came to a quiet and a final end. At dawn, the valley below Hill 734 was a place of profound and deeply unsettling silence. The continuous, defiant roar of the single machine gun, The sound that had been the soundtrack to the company's survival for the past 12 hours was gone. For the men of Dog Company and for their commander, Captain Wallace Davenport, the silence was a heavy and an ambiguous thing. It could mean that the lone heroic sergeant was finally out of ammunition, or it could mean that he was dead. Captain Davenport stood at the edge of his new, more defensible position, his binoculars trained on the summit of the hill. He saw nothing, no movement, no signs of life. The hill was a silent, brooding, and inscrutable mystery. His by-the-book, military mind told him to be cautious. The sergeant, he assumed, was almost certainly dead, and the Germans were now in full, undisputed control of the high ground. He expected a renewed and a massive German assault on his own position to begin at any moment. He put his men on full alert. He prepared for the worst, but the assault never came. The morning wore on, and the silence from the hill remained absolute, unbroken. It was a silence that made no tactical sense. The Germans had the advantage. They should have been pressing their attack, but they were not. It was as if they, too, were gone, as if the entire bloody and brutal battle of the previous day had been nothing more than a fever dream. Captain Davenport was a man who did not like mysteries. He was a man who believed in clear, verifiable facts, and the situation on Hill 734 was a profound and a deeply frustrating violation of all the established rules of war. He was a man who had, just 24 hours earlier, dismissed the idea of a lone sergeant holding that hill as a tactical impossibility. But he had heard the gun. He had seen its effect on the German counterattack, and now he was faced with a silence that was even more inexplicable than the sound had been. He made a decision. It was a decision that was not based on military doctrine or on the orders of his superiors. It was a decision that was born of a new and a deeply unsettling sense of professional curiosity and of a dawning, almost reverent, sense of awe. He had to know. He had to see for himself what had happened on that hill. He assembled a small, hand-picked reconnaissance patrol. "We're going back up," he said, his voice a quiet, grim command. "I want to see what's on that hill." The men he had chosen, all of them veterans, all of them men who had heard the sound of that lone gun, looked at him, and then at the hill, and there was not a single word of protest. They, too, needed to know. The journey back up Hill 734 was a slow, cautious, and almost funereal procession. They moved with a kind of hushed reverence, their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the silent, brooding landscape. They were not soldiers on an assault. They were pilgrims, making their way to a place that had, in the past 12 hours, become something more than just a piece of strategic ground. It had become a legend. As they neared the summit, the full, terrible, and heroic scope of what had happened there began to reveal itself. The slopes of the hill were a landscape of almost unbelievable carnage. They found the bodies of the German flanking platoon, cut to pieces in the narrow gully, just as the sound of the gun had promised. They found the shattered remains of the German frontal assault, their bodies tangled in the tripwires of the improvised grenade traps. They saw, with their own eyes, the physical, bloody evidence of a masterful and a brutally effective defense. And then, they reached the summit. They reached the small, sandbagged machine gun nest. And they found him. He was slumped forward, over the silent, imposing bulk of the German MG-42 machine gun. He was alone. His fatigue jacket was soaked in blood from a dozen different wounds, but he was there. Staff Sergeant Rosco Pedigrew. He was dead, but he had not been defeated. He had fought the enemy to a complete and a total standstill. The sheer, staggering number of German dead that littered the hilltop around his position was a silent and a powerful testament to the ferocity of his impossible and his victorious stand. He had not just held the hill. He had broken the enemy. His solitary, one-man defense had so battered, so demoralized, so completely shattered the German company that they had not just been stopped. They had been defeated, their will to fight extinguished, their counterattack abandoned. Captain Wallace Davenport, the man who had said it was impossible, stood over the body of the quiet backwoods sergeant he had so profoundly and so tragically underestimated. He looked at the scene of carnage. He looked at the solitary, heroic figure of the man who had created it, and he was filled with a sense of awe, of humility, and of a deep and an everlasting professional shame. He had been wrong. The manuals had been wrong. The entire, cynical, and prejudiced doctrine of the United States Army had been wrong. And this man, this quiet, heroic, and now very dead man, was the living and the dying proof of it. The news of what was on the summit of Hill 734 spread through the American lines like a wildfire. The wild, unbelievable rumors that had been circulating for the past 24 hours. The stories of a lone, black sergeant holding off an entire German company were no longer rumors. They were fact. And the story was so incredible, so far beyond the normal parameters of battlefield heroism, that it quickly made its way up the chain of command. That afternoon, a new and a far more official presence arrived on the hilltop. Colonel Sterling, the regimental commander, a decorated veteran of the North Africa campaign, had heard the reports. And like Captain Davenport, he was a man who needed to see the truth for himself. He was a weary, cynical, but ultimately fair-minded officer, a man who had seen enough of the war to know that the impossible sometimes had a way of becoming fact. He arrived by jeep, his face a mask of grim professional skepticism. He was met by Captain Davenport. The young, by-the-book captain was a changed man. The arrogant, confident officer of the day before was gone, replaced by a man who was humbled, sobered, and filled with a profound and a deeply personal sense of awe. He led Colonel Sterling on a silent tour of the summit, a tour of the makeshift battlefield that had been the stage for Sergeant Petigrew's incredible one-man war. He pointed out the kill zone in the gully. He showed him the remains of the improvised grenade traps. He described the sound of the lone machine gun, the sound that had saved his company. Colonel Sterling listened, his skepticism slowly, and then completely, dissolving, replaced by the same sense of profound and almost reverent respect that had so transformed his subordinate. He was a professional soldier, and he could read the story of the battle in the landscape of death that surrounded him. He could see the tactical brilliance, the sheer, animal courage, the almost superhuman endurance that it had taken for one man to do what had been done here. He stood, for a long time, over the body of Sergeant Rosco Pedigrew, still slumped behind his gun. He did not see a black soldier. He did not see an enlisted man from a segregated unit. He saw a warrior. He saw one of the finest soldiers he had ever, in his long and bloody career, had the honor of commanding. "You were right, Captain," Sterling said finally, his voice a low, quiet rumble. "You were right to question the reports, because the reports could never do this justice." He turned to Davenport, his eyes filled with a new and a hard resolve. "This man," he said, his voice now a firm, authoritative command, "did not just die a hero. He saved your company. He may have saved this entire regiment. His story will not be lost. It will not be a rumor. It will be a fact." Colonel Sterling made it his personal and his professional mission to ensure that the promise he made on that hilltop was kept. He personally supervised the collection of the evidence. He ordered a full, detailed after-action report, a report that included the sworn testimony of Captain Davenport, of Private Cecil Covington, and of every other man in Dog Company who had heard the sound of that lone, defiant gun. He took the incredible, and now officially verified, story of Sergeant Rosco Pedigrew's impossible stand, and he sent it up the chain of command, with his own personal and powerful endorsement. He knew that the Army was a deeply flawed and a deeply prejudiced institution. He knew that the story of a black hero from the much-maligned 92nd Infantry Division was an inconvenient truth. But he also knew that an act of courage this profound, this absolute, transcended all of that. It was a story that demanded to be told. The story ends not in the mud and the rain of an Italian mountaintop, but in the quiet, hallowed halls of military history. Staff Sergeant Rosco Pedigrew, the quiet, unassuming hunter from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for military valor. His citation, read aloud by the President of the United States, told the story of the man who had done what an entire army had said was impossible. The legend of the ghost of Monte Cassino was no longer a legend. It was history. a permanent and a powerful testament to the fact that true courage knows no color, and that the heart of a single, determined soldier can be more powerful than an entire army.